Check it. This is more than pro-black recognition of the facts. That prolific proposition that initiated rap. They don't seem to understand it ain't about us fighting back until we learn to be preemptive. All we can do is react. Stuck up in a cycle, victim homicidal, viral instances, Instagram images, then forget what the mission is. Witness to the premises of prison systems that damages villages permanently. Terminally influenced, the ending is congruent with the ignorance. Let's talk about it. We've been rerouted. Tear gas to symbolize the way in which our sight is clouded. Surrounded by misguided principles, nonsensical how government is non-reciprocal to justice. It just is a framework protecting non-adjustment. And we call that injustice. And God that we trusted, but with the state of our America, sometimes we get disgusted. Because how can we side with the corrupted when rights have been abducted? We need revolutionary eruption, radical combustion. So let us become the interruption. Start a new discussion. Good evening. It is my pleasure to be in this space with you and to be alongside Dr. Michelle Voss Roberts to talk about our paper of how the sacred is being redefined by the people. And this paper arose out of an increasing need to join and support grassroots social justice movements, and in particular that of the Black Lives Matter movement, but also movements that sit adjacent to it. The rap that you just heard was in fact written in the wake of the death of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. So building on the work of Michelle's book, Taste of the Divine, which she'll tell you more about momentarily, we've used an Indian aesthetic theory to examine unique components of these grassroots social movements and how as ministers and witnesses of the gospel, we can be attuned to it and be better listeners of the theological and Christological embodiment that is present. So after much examination, we thought it poignant to exemplify the elements of these movements by taking a deeper look at one of its principal forms, which is hip hop, both in our backyard and across the globe. And as a hip hop artist myself, I have a particular experience with the centrality of this art form in these movements. I'm also an ordained reverend in the Baptist tradition. So we're excited to share this with you, and I also want to add that this is beyond just hip hop as music. This is hip hop culture in all of its artistic forms, one of which is clothing, and so we've intentionally decided that I would embody that, and Michelle would embody the clothing that's sacred to her in this particular space, and that we can. And that we can join each other in this work together, both in our authentic truths.
My project has been to examine a Hindu and Christian theology of emotion by employing the classical aesthetic theory of India. This theory is a theory of rasa, which has a number of meanings, the first of which is to describe the blissful, transcendent effect that art has. It's transcendent in that art can transport us out of ourselves beyond egocentricity so that we can savor an emotional mood. And so the Indian Hindu theologians have employed the concept of rasa to describe not only the original context, which is from Bharata's Natya Shastra, a manual on drama, but that same theory is used to talk about religious experience, the experience of Brahman, the experience of devotional worship of God. And so rasa is that sort of effect of experiencing good art, but rasa is also a word that stands for each of the 9 basic moods that are savored in art. Nava rasa means these 9 rasas: love, humor, fury, compassion, disgust, heroism, fear, wonder, and peace. Each of these is rooted in a basic common human emotion, but elevated through art so that people can savor it in that more generalized and non-egocentric way. The Natya Shastra lays out how rasa is produced. And it's in this Rasa Sutra, a short little pithy saying about how it's produced. It comes through the combination of excitants or vibhavas, indicators, anubhavas, and transitory emotional states, vyabhichari bhavas. So when all of these things are together, a rasa will arise in an audience. And you'll hear more about what these are in a little bit. So my project was to examine 3 of these basic emotions as religious emotions, and to do it in a comparative way. So I examined peace, the peace of meditation, as a place where the 2 traditions can communicate. Love for divinity, devotional love, as another bridge. And then also fury at injustice. And so what I claim in this book is that rasa is a way of describing how interreligious understanding can take place. Now, I published this book in 2014. 2014 was also the year in which Officer Darren Wilson shot Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Michael Brown's body lay in the street for hours, inciting protests like maybe we've never seen before. And since then, this overlaps with the time that Demi and I spent together at Wake Forest in North Carolina. We saw movement after movement that embodied a similar sort of feeling. And reflecting on that, in light of this theory, we want to name another rasa. This is kind of a playful exercise of adding an additional rasa to the canon. And we're calling it the rasa of challenge. This is a cross-cultural phenomenon that stands up against injustice, it responds to injustice, but also builds solidarity across different contexts.
So while it's true that other genres of music and other forms of art participate in this rasa of challenge, we assert that hip hop offers an especially salient example of a genre whose context and expressions are being mobilized to challenge injustice across cultures. And while many US hip hop records might carry themes of wealth and pleasure, there are a plethora of justice oriented hip hop artists that are creating art that really lies at the heart of movements like Black Lives Matter. So by attending to the rasa of challenge with hip hop expressions as our focus, we want to be clear that we are not advocating that Christian missions adopt hip hop as a medium or form for carrying the gospel message.
Rather, what we're advocating is that the learning for us as religious leaders is that we should become what the Indian aesthetic theory calls sahridayas. This is it's a kind of a connoisseur of art, but the word literally means one whose heart, hrid, resonates with sa, the mood of a performance. So even though rasa theory claims that all of the basic aesthetic emotions are rooted in common human emotions that we can all understand, to become really a connoisseur of art, a cultured viewer, it takes a little bit of training. So Bharatanatyam, for example, is a dance form inspired by and in the tradition of the Natya Shastra. And there's a lot that I can understand by watching a Bharatanatyam performance, but there's a lot that I don't understand. For example, the particularity of various mudras or hand gestures. I'm going to have to study a little bit. I'm going to have to learn more so that I can fully savor the mood of a performance. And similarly, for me, I need to be educated about what's happening in hip hop so that I can understand it as well. And so the claim that we're making is that by attuning our hearts to the rasa of challenge, to attending to how the sacred is being redefined by the people, we might catch something of the heartbeat of Christ and participate in the movement of the Spirit in the world.
So since we're placing hip hop at the center of this conversation for exemplifying the rasa of challenge, I want to give you a brief overview of the history of hip hop and where it's headed and where it is now. And so let's take a look at hip hop. Hip hop began in the early 1970s in Bronx, New York, alongside a post industrial backdrop. And this was a time where pioneering DJs such as DJ Kool Herc, African Bambaataa, DJ Grandmaster Flash started disc jockeying in a way where they would loop records, they would loop the break beats of records to make a seamless continuation of sound or of the get down portion of these records so that people who were gathered at parties could dance to these sounds. And those dancers we now know as break dancers because they were dancing on the break beat. You also might know them as B-boys or B-girls. And then out of this, we have the rise of the MC or the master of ceremonies. And this was a person who had a particular rhythmic way with words, a poetic way with words, and they would hype up the DJ and the dancers and the crowd. And now we know those artists today as rappers or rap artists. And then also during this time, graffiti became linked as one of the principal visual forms of the hip hop movement. So, although hip hop gained its popularity initially through parties, it quickly became a vessel for social justice messages. And many early hip hop artists used this form of expression to address social issues in their community. And one of the earliest and most notable examples of this type of subject matter is the record The Message, which you see the cover art here with DJ Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. And the song features lyrics that speak about the reality and the impact of living in poverty, and most notably some of the lines, "Don't push me 'cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head." Ha 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 ha. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under, right? And that jungle that they're speaking to is this jungle of Bronx, New York, right? In juxtaposition to a downtown New York that was flourishing. And so that's something you see as a visual cue in the video. They show these images side by side of how they're living, and just down the street, how wealth is flourishing. And so this not only shows up in this video, in this performance, but there are other performances in early hip hop by NWA and Dead Prez and Queen Latifah that go on to tackle issues of poverty and police brutality and sexism and so on and so forth. And so really once hip hop started to be recorded and made its way across the nation, it really began to make its way across the globe. And so in recent decades, we've seen how hip hop has tremendously spread across the globe, putting it in a unique position of intercultural and interreligious dialogue. The proliferation of hip hop can be seen in a diverse array of hip hop artists worldwide. And additionally, the universal popularity of hip hop can be seen in the sold out shows that are played by US artists in countries abroad. In some countries where English is not the primary language, even though these artists are performing English raps. But again, there are artists who rap in all sorts of languages, and even tomorrow we're going to see this in another lecture. We're going to hear about an artist, Christian artist from Mozambique. And then another way we see this show up is in hip hop festivals, one of which is the Trinity International Hip Hop Festival, which takes place in Connecticut every year at Trinity College. It's been taking place for about 14 years now. This year, I had the privilege of performing at this festival back in April. And this is a place where hip hop artists from all over, rappers, breakdancers, graffiti artists, and scholars come and convene and perform and do ciphers and really share in the global phenomena that hip hop is today. Yep.
So we've described rasa, aesthetic theory. We've described a little bit about hip hop, and now we'd like to put them together. The question we're asking is, what is it about this aesthetic of challenge that resonates so strongly across cultures? We're going to use rasa theory to assist us in naming the ingredients for this potent recipe. So you'll remember that rasa arises in the spectator of a drama through the combination of excitants, indicators, and transitory emotional states. I'll just give you one example from the literature. If you're watching a love story, you would need some contextual factors to excite that mood. So it might be the presence of a beautiful other person. It might be a full moon or a lovely setting like a garden. Those would be the kind of contextual excitants that might awaken love. And then in a drama, you would see indicators. The actors, or that maybe the poem, would evoke physical signs that one is feeling these things. So the lovers might get ready and dress up and put on makeup for one another, or they might blush or cast sidelong glances at one another, that kind of thing. And then there might be a variety of emotions in the drama, in the narrative, that heighten the overall mood of love. For example, there might be anger, a lover's quarrel, that contributes to the overall rasa of love. So in looking at the rasa of challenge, let's take a look at each of these factors.
Cool. So we're going to take a look at the excitants or the contextual markers of this rasa of challenge and how they show up in hip hop performance. So some of the most prevalent excitants seen in hip hop performance include poverty, police brutality, drugs, and gun violence. And excitants such as poverty and police brutality really show up in a great example in this group named DAM, D-A-M. And this is an Israeli-Palestinian group that was formed in 1999 by a rapper named Tamir Nafar. And he decided to start this group because he witnessed Tupac Shakur's music, and he saw the music video and saw the police brutality and the poverty depicted in the music video and thought to himself, wow, that's what's going on here in Israel, Palestine, present day. And so these stills are taken from a video by this group, and the song is called Born Here. And the group is aiming to shed light on the conditions of their neighborhood in Lod. So this is a Palestinian group that has Israeli citizenship. So they live in the city of Lod, and where they experience a lot of poverty and oppression, which is evident in the visual cues, such as a police station that replaced a school, other demolished buildings, and a lack of utilities, such as water and electricity. And so the video actually begins with this scene of an armed Israeli patrol approaching and harassing the Palestinian group as they begin to belt out their rap lyrics and performance. And so in the first verse, rapper Mahmoud Greri introduces listeners to the town of Lod, where law enforcement officers label Palestinians as criminal just for living there. The second verse is rapped by Tamir himself, where he talks about how many homes are destroyed in Lod, and the video eventually cuts to scenes of the rap group performing amid the rubble and the dust of their homeland. So then we move on to the indicators. And the indicators for the rasa of challenge in hip hop really show up in things that are shameless gestures. So we see this in acts of shouting and crowds raising their fists, dancing and wearing divergent styles of clothing to give off this confidence and this strength in community. And so we have here still taken from Kendrick Lamar's performance of his song King Kunta. Kendrick Lamar is from Compton, California. He's an American rapper. And if you follow most of his music, he raps about the hardships of living and growing up in Compton. And so in the video, there are various scenes where there are these shameless gestures. He's claiming to be king. He's claiming to be royal. He's sitting on a throne surrounded by men of all different generations, showing that community strength and defying the stereotypes that are placed on him as a Black man in America. And then lastly, the third major ingredient for this rasa of challenge, the complementary emotional states, which are a variety of sentiments that add depth and nuance to this mood. And so for this rasa of challenge, these might show up as anger, anxiety, fear, numbness, hope, motivation, innovation, pride, survival, and solidarity. But what I really want to talk about is the bravado that is really pervasive in this hip hop aesthetic. And so this is demonstrated, like I said before, in fashion, but it's also demonstrated in different words. And so this group here is Crudas Cubensi, and they're a Cuban hip hop duo, and this is from their performance Mi Cuerpo es Mío, My Body is Mine. And so they're reclaiming their bodies for themselves and showing this great confidence and bravado in solidarity with marginalized groups of women of Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean descent. And so the artists reclaim their bodies as well as their voices as queer women. And so in the repeated lines in this song, translated in English, you hear, "Keep your rosaries out of my ovaries," where the duo is challenging the religious authority with the claim that women own their bodies and not the Catholic Church.
So we've seen that these three factors are things that can be seen across cultural contexts. The excitants or contextual factors resonate in multiple places. The physical indicators that one is embodying this mood of challenge are similar across contexts, and there's a whole range of complementary emotions that resonate there. And this rasa is something that bridges contexts. So this is going to be a little bit different than the classical Indian theory. In the Natya Shastra, the rasa of fury, or that arises out of anger, is depicted in very class-based ways. It's tends to be show up in characters that are low caste or demonic, and it's a very destructive rasa. And so noble people don't tend to depict the rasa of fury. Maybe a hero would depict courage instead, right? It's a heroic rasa, but anger is really a low class type of thing to do. What we see here is that the Natya Shastra, the classical theory, is written from a dominant stratum of society. So what we're asking here when we look at challenge is to listen from the margins and understand that what's happening here is life-giving. It challenges the status quo in a way that that demands the humanity of people at those margins. And what we want to claim is that we can savor this rasa of challenge also in the gospel. So when we read in scripture and remember the Exodus people leaving slavery, we can taste something of this challenge. When we think about Jesus and see how he gathers around himself a group of people to construct a different set of values than the Roman Empire, this kind of rasa shows up, and we think that it serves as a kind of template so we can recognize it other places as well. So today, many people revere the martyrs of Latin America who were and are in solidarity with the Latin American-based communities. And now, again, with everybody having a cell phone and videos proliferating, the excitants and indicators and transitory emotional states are right in front of us all the time if we're paying attention. And so if ministers of the gospel are attuned to them, challenge will arise.
So we have a wonderful quote here from Brittany Gray, who is a Ferguson activist and also a seminary student. And she says, while I agree that there is moral authority that comes from the church, this movement was not started by the church. This is really a movement of the streets. It's a hip hop movement. And so as much as I am made and informed by the church, I am just as much made and informed by hip hop as a culture. I live and breathe it. And so, yes, I would have been engaged regardless because I grew up listening to Tupac and Biggie, to Common, to Dead Prez, to Eric B. and Rakim. I grew up on all of it, which told me that the system was messed up. And I cannot listen to those lyrics, see those lyrics, internalize those lyrics, and not have a response. And so what she's really describing here is that the driver of this movement, of Black Lives Matter and many other movements, is not from the pews, but rather from the music and the aesthetics she grew up on. So while the church participates in the movement, it must recognize that the essence and the very nature of the movement was birthed from the aesthetic proclamation of hip hop several decades ago. The artists she names are most prominent late 80s, early 90s. And what this implies is that clergy are invited to listen and to be attuned to the proclamation and the witness of the aesthetic itself.
So this conference challenged us to think about what mission might look like in the context of the rasa of challenge. And the first thing that we would say is that it requires that clergy roles, missionary roles, shift out of the center of activity. Leah Gunning Francis describes in her book Ferguson and Faith that there was a moment during the protest on September 29th, 2014 in Ferguson, when the police and the protesters were squaring off and tensions were very heightened and it looked like violence was about to break out. And the clergy who were there decided to put their bodies in the way. They went between the two lines, knelt down in the street, and began to pray. And the mood changed. The police didn't really know what to do with this, and the tension kind of dissipated. This is a different kind of protester, right? The tension dissipated, and nobody got arrested that night. And after the prayer, one of the clergy members asked the activist leader, "What do you want us to do now?" And they said, "Thank you very much. We've got this now." And the clergy went and stood on the sidewalk again. They took their place at the sidelines. So ancillary roles. In the Ferguson protest, you see the clergy putting their bodies on the line. They would go to jail when the protesters were arrested. They would offer various kinds of assistance. For example, they would bring their cell phones in so that the people who had been arrested could stay connected in their grassroots organization. They would call judges and lawyers to work for their release. And they would also be a conduit of information so that what the media was portraying wasn't the only information that people would have about the protest. So the first thing is these ancillary leadership roles in a movement like this. The second has to do with why the expressions of this kind of mission are going to be countercultural. And it's because of the perception of impurity that adheres to movements like this. Rima Vesely-Flad writes about this quite a bit in her book on the movement. She observed that Jesus touched the untouchable. He associated with people on the margins, and he himself died a shameful and polluted death. And she sees a strong resonance with the racialized pollution boundaries that permeate American culture today. Drawing an interfaith link, the interfaith leader Eboo Patel writes in a recent book about how growing up in Chicago, he was very attracted to hip hop, which his parents discouraged him from listening to because it was an impure musical form. So this theme of impurity shows up all the time in these contexts. And when clergy associate their vestments and rituals with Black and brown bodies, with hip hop artists, with people of diverse faiths and no faith at all, Rima Vesely-Flad tells us, there's a symbolic reversal. The protesters, Black and brown, confrontational, represent moral purity.
And lastly, there's solidarity and repentance. Clergy in Ferguson have described this instinctual shift to recognize the worth and authority of lay protesters as repentance. Sean Jones, an assistant pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church Complex in St. Louis, recalls, and I quote, "We apologize for not getting it. We apologize for the inconsistent presence of the Black church in the community before this moment," end quote. So by listening to people fed up with injustice and by accepting protesters as they are, Christian leaders and clergy are inspired, drawn in, and converted anew to the gospel task. More than just a notional acceptance, their affects and emotions change when they have truly tasted the rasa of challenge. They start to experience the affective states appropriate to this mode of engagement. And because they've entered into the embodied practices, music, and stories of protest, their response to others is not with disgust, but it's one that is out of love and solidarity that permeates their ministry.
When I was researching Tastes of the Divine, I ran into a kind of paradox in Indian Christian spirituality that had to do with caste, actually. So the Dalit Christians that I met when I was researching the book really strongly resisted classical art forms as sort of helpful for them because they stemmed from upper caste, but also because there was the perception that the art forms themselves were pacifying, that they sort of blunted some of the anger that was actually really, really important to their spirituality. And so they preferred folk styles of art for their worship and for their protests. And so I kept encountering this conversation about, well, if you're only angry all the time, what's going to sustain you? Don't you need some meditation? But no, is that actually an oppressive form of spirituality, and so forth? What we're seeing here and what we want to claim is that peace might be a complementary emotional state to the rasa of challenge. When the clergy knelt down and prayed, they brought a moment of silence, but it wasn't a moment of silencing. It was a way of giving voice to the angst and suffering of the protesters. And it probably saved some lives, actually. Nobody got shot, nobody went to jail. Those who had been shouting for recognition of their humanity stood alongside people who heard their cries. So it wasn't a peace that was pacifying. It was a taste of the inbreaking reign of God. And so peace is a complementary emotional state to the rasa of challenge. Its surprise appearances are placeholders for the eschaton, the desired future state of affairs in which all are accepted, all are recognized as created in the divine image, in which everyone can walk down the street or drive a car without being molested, in which each person has a chance at a future. These tastes of peace, which are part of a ministry of presence, hold a place for hope. And so ministry and mission still participate in the eschaton and anticipate it. Until God's will is done on earth as in heaven, ministry will have the flavor of challenge.
So I will end on a peaceful note of more hip hop. So there's a reason why we do what we do, move how we move. Basis for the way that we groove, speaking in tunes, culture birth from rhythm and blues, hip-hop the news, so come and take a walk in our shoes. We are canvases lifted up by justice's easel, rewriting the narrative, and this is only a preview. So if you want to make a difference in society's sequel, swallow your pride, let sacred be redefined by the people. Thank you.
Mi